Hey everyone, it's great to have you all joining us. I am Peter Askim, and I'm the Artistic Director of the next Festival of Emerging Artists. We're super excited to have you all here, and I'm really excited to have Jason Haaheim here to talk about the art of deliberate practice. Practicing is this kind of black box that nobody ever talks about, but Jason has a real way of communicating. I just know you're going to really enjoy him. Many of you already may know him, and those of you don't, you're in for a real treat. Jason, it's great to see you.
Thanks, Peter. This is a real treat to be with you guys. Thanks for arranging this. And I'm especially, happy to have the chance to work with you all during what, as you mentioned, are pretty extraordinary times. Just share my screen here so you guys can see that, what we're talking about is deliberate practice. And, over the last few years, really, one of my main priorities for teaching has sprung from this, realization that Peter just mentioned, for how rare it is for young or really any aspiring musicians to be coached on how to really practice, like how to practice with efficacy and efficiency, and that there's a method to this. It's often glossed over in schooling and with teachers that kind of tell you what to do, but maybe not how to do it. And so my focus for these two sessions, there's this today, and then there's the follow-up next Thursday. It's going to be on this concept of deliberate practice, the methodology of it, and how I believe it can equip you well, no matter where you end up in music or anywhere else. And so the idea here is this is sort of like a two-part message. I'm starting today with what I believe to be the really kind of necessary philosophical orientation to this, and talking about this pesky notion of talent. And then from that, we're going to set this up, and the next session is going to be all about breaking, deconstructing this, going through the methodology, talking about the framework, and then going through some really applied examples of how I did it in my own career. Now, quick definition can be helpful here. Deliberate practice, I'm basically saying it is the scientific method applied to your craft. It is a slow, rigorous, incremental, endless process of experimentation to cultivate specific skills. It is not mindless repetition, right? It is focused and attentive, specifically targeting weaknesses, and then using feedback loops to improve your performance. It's the most efficient process of skill development, and it's accessible to all of us. Now, notably, you look on this page, and it doesn't say music on here anywhere. That's one of the key insights that we're going to talk about that emerged from this field of research in about the last 30 years, that this is something cross-disciplinary and generalizable. Now, I'm obviously coming from an orchestral background, right? And so I understand that like not everyone here today is on an orchestral track, and that's great, right? In fact, I totally celebrate that. I think there's a lot of ways to have a music career, to have music in your life, and that it's often a real problem if people are only doing this one thing tunnel visioned, right? I tend to think of that as the fallacy of the pure artist, and I'll kind of get into that more later on. But while I'll be talking about my own process and my approach to deliberate practice through the lens of my own experience, which is practicing, auditioning, and performing in this orchestral world, I just got to reiterate, there's absolutely nothing about any of this that is specific to an orchestral track. It is highly generalizable. Now, that being said, as long as we are mentioning the orchestral world, I kind of feel the need to address the elephant in the room here. And that is that the Metropolitan Opera, my home institution, has been in the news a lot lately, and not for good reasons. I'm going to spare you my personal rants on all of this. And instead, I want to use the situation of the Met as a window into some of the larger themes I've been planning to address anyway. And what Peter kind of kicked off in that intro saying, like, yeah, we're living in crazy times to be a performing artist. And I'll start here. I mean, on March 12th, 2020, over a year ago, Lincoln Center shut down, and the MET Orchestra was indefinitely furloughed without pay. A year later, we still remained without pay and in this vicious contract battle, it's looking less and less likely we're going to be performing in the fall. And, you know, we're facing this situation where, as has happened in other orchestras around the country, to be clear, you know, orchestra managements are sort of using this pandemic as an opportunity to try to get cuts and you know, changes to the contract and elimination of work rules and protections and all the stuff that they've been seeking for 15 years anyway. And now they're like, oh, perfect opportunity. But without getting into the rants of all of that in the orchestra world, I think there's something important to recognize, that if me, a principal timpanist of the Metropolitan Opera, the largest and most influential performing arts organization in America, you know, if I can be facing 2 or more years of unemployment, like, we need to face the facts. The performing arts in the 21st century are just fundamentally unstable. You know, that's just the pleasant, unavoidable reality. But I want to be very clear about this. Like, I'm not mentioning any of this to be a downer, right? Or to discourage anyone from pursuing their passion in music. Far from it, right? I think what it's really about is kind of redirecting us to how we maybe should have been framing this all to begin with, which is, I think it's essential that aspiring musicians in 2021 are given a realistic look at the performing arts world they're inheriting, and specifically how that compels us to focus on ideas of sustainability and flexibility. What often happens, and again, this definitely applies to the orchestral track, but certainly not exclusively, you might get some sort of ignition point in high school, right? This is kind of when it happened for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then at some point, you make the choice to study music in undergrad. Maybe this is at a conservatory, or maybe it's just a school with a great music program. Oftentimes, then you proceed on to a master's degree, and then there's some sort of like nebulous definition of a sustainable career on the other side of that. But in between is this perilous period that all too often gets overlooked and sort of unmentioned in the glossy marketing materials from some, you know, elite conservatories. And the thing is, right, this is how it looked in the before times. Like, our musician careers were fraught with this perilous period where you get out of school and you know, you're on your own. You're no longer accountable weekly to a teacher. Especially if you're a percussionist, you're just lacking gear, right? Like, if you're in my situation, you're like, oh no, I don't have any instruments anymore. And yet you still need to keep getting better, right? You need to get up to this point where, whether it's, you know, performing as a chamber musician or having a robust teaching studio, you know, premiering new music, auditioning for orchestras, like, you still need to keep refining your craft to get to that point. The thing is now, I mean, the COVID era has kind of put us all back in that perilous period. A lot of friends of mine in the New York music scene, very successful, you know, freelancers on Broadway and everything, are sitting there asking themselves for the last year, like, wow, what am I doing here? Like, what, and what am I going to be doing? How am I going to make this sustainable 5-10 years from now? To be clear about this, the peril period that I'm talking about here, this gap between school and sustainability, it's not just my opinion. I have actual statistics to back this up. When I got to the MET Orchestra, one of the things I did initially in my early kind of year and a half there was assist our orchestra committee in a contract negotiation. And one of the parts of that was to do a sort of demographic survey of our own members. And so we conducted this poll that was just asking people anonymously, you know, how old were you when you won your audition for the MET Orchestra, and how many auditions had you taken? It was a really interesting set of results that basically confirmed exactly what my hunch was. And that is that we tend to hear about these really exceptional outlier cases where, you know, somebody wins a job straight out of school, or, you know, they were a junior at Curtis and this thing happens. But that is just not the norm, right? If you look at this, that's the end of a bachelor's degree. It's the end of a master's degree. That's me right there. That's my little dot. And then that's one of my colleagues with some real tenacity. But you look at this and the average here, the scatter plot is basically saying, yeah, in this specific orchestral track, this takes a while, right? You can't count on winning a job straight out of school. It's ludicrous. Like, this really takes years. People tend to win jobs late 20s, early 30s after having taken 10 to 20 auditions. And then there are variations beyond that. But, I think it's imperative, right? Like, we're all facing different versions of this, no matter where we are in a performing arts career. Especially as we look to a COVID adapted and sort of post-COVID future. I just believe it's imperative that aspiring musicians recognize the need to be able to set up for this long game, right? And to be able to pursue and improve their craft for many years sustainably, outside of school and then continuing beyond that. Again, the reality is that even in the best case scenarios on the orchestral track, it takes years to earn an audition win. And no one can promise you that's going to happen, right? Like, no one can guarantee that's going to work out. Anyone that does is honestly lying or trying to sell you something. I've witnessed, especially in the last year and a half, a sort of unfortunate proliferation of these premium online music courses that are often charging astronomical amounts of money, making big promises, and sort of preying upon musicians' very understandable sort of anxiety and almost desperation about the future. And, often using some of these kind of multi-level marketing, predatory business tactics. And that's a really unfortunate, I think, development in our field. Because the thing is, like, from my perspective, and as you'll see through these two presentations, like, you can't make those promises. Like, there is no magic bullet for career success. It just doesn't exist, right? And everything about deliberate practice is really about embracing the opposite, right? It's about a process and a methodology that will help you refine your craft the best you can. And that, my assertion is that then gives you the best odds in this long game, whatever track it is you're on. But maybe more importantly than that, it also has these really important spillover benefits through the rest of your life, conferring versatile skills to make this long road more sustainable. Again, it's been my experience that how to practice, the method of this, is something few people really dive into in school, and it seems to be given far, far too little attention in general. So let me get a little more specific now, because deliberate practice is a term coined by my mentor and somebody who I really came to consider a friend, legendary researcher named Anders Ericsson. You may have seen or read about my connection to Anders. He's the intellectual father of deliberate practice. Certainly not the only person researching this, but the first and sort of most well-known. Just really a towering researcher in psychology in any regard. And you may have also seen a tribute post that I wrote last summer, because he passed away suddenly back on June 17th. Anyone who's worked with me knows how fully Anders' research really permeates kind of everything I do and teach. And part of the reason I'm passionate about teaching this material and this idea of deliberate practice is because it's one of these unique areas where science can directly impact the outcomes in people's lives right now. What I mean by that is in my previous career, which I'll talk about a bit, working in nanotech, there's often these times where you're kind of cranking away on scientific problems and publishing results with the hope that, 30 or 40 years later, it might result in something. You all may have seen recently about this, the pioneering scientist who started working on the mRNA platform. This was like 25 or 30 years ago, that eventually became, the whole basis for our revolutionary vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna. Well, that's one of these like long game scientific investments. But my hope is that some of the results from Anders' work and the way, I and other musicians have implemented it, can be something you start applying today. It's actionable, right? So I'm dedicated to helping people think about this methodology for how to practice and approach expertise and expert performance in its broadest sense. It was about like 2012 when I started pulling this material together for myself. The animating idea being, what would I tell myself if I could travel back in time to around 2006, when I was starting to get, serious about being a musician. And it's not an exaggeration to say then that, when I encountered this research and generally kind of Anders' life work, it really transformed my approach to music and practicing and my worldview and almost my entire sense of self, which is all to say that, I'm grateful that I had the chance to tell him directly that his research has been one of the most singularly impactful things in my own life. So the session today, it's, we're gonna set this up with this foundation, and we're gonna talk about the framework next week. But it's about this process of practicing, how you can do it in the most effective and smartest way possible. Because as mentioned with that brief definition at the top, it is not just about, shedding tons of mindless hours. That's what a lot of people kind of tend to do by default, but that doesn't really get you very far. Instead, it is about smart work and the incremental improvements that accumulate over a long period of time when done well. These concepts then sort of join my dual identities as a scientist first, and then, kind of evolving into this performing artist. And it's the thing that I credit, that enabled me to go from working as an engineer at a nanotech company for 10 years in Chicago to then playing principal timpani in the Metropolitan Opera. So by way of introduction, I think it's worth showing you kind of the evidence of my contrasting career experiences here.
Hi, my name is Jason Haaheim, application scientist at Nano Inc. In this video, I'll be giving you a guided tour of the dip pen nanolithography process enabled by our instrumentation and software.
Fantastic. So yeah, that was 2003. Fewer gray hairs ago, but that was one of my first charges at this nanotech company to come up with this demonstration video for one of our pieces of instrumentation. So that was then. This is more recent.
How did a scientist become a principal timpanist with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra? Jason Haaheim gets that question all the time. He's a former nanotechnologist with a master's in electrical engineering. He's 38, and 4 years ago, he made a major life pivot to play professionally with the MET Orchestra. Jason Haaheim has joined us from our studios in New York to talk about his winding career path. Jason, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Melissa. It's great to be here.
So a lot of people find that transition pretty unusual, pretty crazy. As evidenced by the producers at NPR, must have seen a blog post and they're like, hey, let's put this guy on Weekend Edition. And it was honestly pretty stressful because I'm used to performing in the pit at the Met, but hearing my own voice on public radio was a little weird. Nevertheless, I hope that at least by the end of today, and certainly by the end of the session next week, you'll find that transition a little less crazy. Because here is my core proposition, really. Our job as musicians is to vibrate air at people and make them feel a thing. It's really just that simple. The thing is, being effective at this requires refining your craft through lessons and through practice. And it is my experience that many aspiring musicians make insufficient progress in this craft refinement, not because they're not talented, and we're going to unpack that a lot in a few minutes, but rather because they never figured out how to really practice. Once I put my mind to it, got focused on this, I actually believe that my unique background as a scientist predisposed me to kind of figure out how to onboard more of this research more quickly. This is what Anders coined deliberate practice. And the thing is, it does not depend on innate talent. Rather, as I mentioned, it depends on being tenacious and methodical, essentially applying the scientific method to the craft of music over a long period of time. And it is totally available to you. if you want it. Now, for a little bit more background, I'm going to go through this kind of obligatory bio here, right? This is what we've got on the MET Orchestra musicians page. I was appointed principal timpanist in 2013. We've got our performances at Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall, can be seen and heard with the MET on the radio back when we were still playing. We got the live and HD movie broadcast, all that stuff, blah, 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 blah. I sort of show this to illustrate that I am personally, I get very bored and almost tired of these bios. They're necessary in our industry. I get it, but it doesn't really tell the real story. It definitely doesn't tell the most important story. If I may, here's kind of a more accurate bio. Hailed by many orchestra audition committees as unconvincing, Jason Haaheim just barely escaped the clutches of permanent obscurity when he was appointed principal timpanist of the Met. Prior to that, he'd been racked by a persistent and gnawing doubt about his musical worth. That doubt was fed by a parade of distinguished conducttors, under whose batons Mr. Haaheim was highlighted for his bad time, unsteady rhythm, and what pitch is that even? Since 2006, Mr. Haaheim emerged as a player of singular distinction, having been cut from more audition rounds than nearly any of his peers. Positions in youth orchestras remained on his professional resume for an embarrassingly long time. Mr. Haaheim grew up in Chaska, Minnesota, the same town as the second most memorable prostitute from the Coen Brothers movie Fargo. Don't know if you guys remember that movie, but my hometown got a shout out. Now, yeah, it's a little bit tongue in cheek for a bio, but only a little, because to begin with, I really think we need to take on these two big concepts, failure and talent. And the thing is that I don't really believe in either of them, or rather, I don't believe talent exists in the way most people think about it. And I believe failure is not a bad thing. Failure has to be embraced. The thing is, what I dislike about those little, 150, 200 word bios is that they sort of give this impression, like this little business card at the tip of the iceberg representing success. And it's ignoring the reality of this story, which, in my case is this big, submerged, vast, icy mass of failure. So much failure, right? But one of the things I want to kind of focus on here is that I eventually learned it didn't have to be framed that way. I could just as easily frame it as constructive growth. Failure is a perception. And in doing this and in kind of muddling my way through a lot of these failures, I learned to embrace a process of continuous improvement rather than being fixated on outcomes or end results that were really beyond my control. And it's a good thing I did this, because my end results contained an awful lot of losing. So prior to the Met, the auditions I lost included Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, Fort Worth twice, Virginia National Arts Center, Fort Wayne, San Diego twice, Calgary twice, Pittsburgh, Oregon, Dallas, Bergen, St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, National Symphony, Seoul, Oslo, Grand Rapids, Tucson, and Cincinnati. So I took 28 professional auditions, and I lost most of them, right? I think it's safe to say that 99% of the orchestral players you ever meet will have lost more auditions than they've won. That's just the reality. Those are the numbers. Again, I emphasize that while we have this framework of auditioning in the orchestral track, there's nothing unique about this, right? I often define auditions very broadly as anytime you have to perform under pressure at your best, and where that's going to have some impact on opportunities you have later. So this might be a recital, an important solo performance, a job interview, right? It could be a lot of these things. And I really think that what I'm saying here applies to any of them, right? Because the thing is, encountering failure in these situations, it's not easy, right? For many people, it can become very soul crushing. And I saw it. I saw it in the circuit as I was auditioning. But along the way, I was able to take to heart this fundamental idea of continuous improvement, and really viewing each audition in its broadest sense as a chance to improve and learn, which is, I was sort of thinking is losing constructively. Because really, if I come away from that and just say, I lost that audition, it defines the experience too narrowly. That list I rattle off there, 28 auditions that I lost. Well, there are details in there that matter, right? How did you lose? How did I advance? I did. I started advancing more consistently. Were you runner up? That happened, right? Did you play your best? Did you demonstrate improvement over the last time? Those things matter. And, from a certain kind of philosophical point of view, I kind of argue that's the whole point, continuous improvement. And so to recap then, I basically became a tenacious loser with a healthy philosophy. And that philosophy is really part of the key, I think, to set up this foundation of an approach to deliberate practice, because it is not necessarily the norm in our field. And I want to make these kind of two philosophical paradigms a bit more explicit, if you'll allow me. Here we go.
I'd never been to an audition before. It was upsetting. A grotesque carnival of human misery.
To be fair, I did not think Kathy Geist was going to finish her song by taking off her underpants.
However, the process was a pleasant reminder that some of us are, in fact, better than others.
So, for the 30 Rock fans out there, we've got Jack Donaghy and his definition of auditioning or evaluating people under pressure. Then we've got the counter view.
So was there points in the career though where you were like, this isn't happening fast enough, or this isn't working out?
No.
Really?
No.
That's amazing. A sort of determination.
Well, I think it's because I didn't have any attachment to an outcome. I think when people enter this business with that, like you'll hear people say, I'm going to give it a year. I'm going to give it a good solid year. And if I haven't made it by then, and I'm saying, what do you mean? What's make it? What does that mean?
Right.
Made it. You haven't made it. And so everybody has their different idea. But that's attaching your life to an outcome of some, ambiguous kind of way. Yeah. But if you love this art form and you commit your life to it, then all you really want is opportunity to be able to make a living. And however that takes you, it in its circuitous roots,
Yeah.
It's never A to B to C to D.
Sure.
It's always a different way.
So we've got these two paradigms, the grotesque carnival of human misery versus I didn't have any attachment to an outcome. It's obvious which one I'm focusing on, but in a way to make this more personal for a minute, I hear Brent Cranston talking about that. And over the years, it's kind of resonated with me even more and more and more. And what I mean by that is that if I had attached my whole life value to the outcome of performing with the Metropolitan Opera, well, these last 14 months would have been even more brutal than they already are. I really embrace the fact that I get a chance to teach and do seminars and classes like this and have this more multidimensional definition of what it means to me to be a performing artist and a musician and a teacher and all of these other things, right? And here's the thing, many people in certainly that I know in the scene in New York City, in the US generally, worldwide, treat auditioning and or this kind of career struggle through the performing arts as this grotesque carnival of human misery. And look, yeah, there are a lot of things about it that are difficult and grossly unfair. And I'm gonna talk about those in a minute. But it also gives into a lot of suffering where I think it doesn't have to be that way. Again, specific to the orchestral track, I kind of decided, well, I'm going to let this process of auditioning make me better. It can make you a more compelling and more refined and more musical artist if you let it. If you buy into the right philosophy for the whole process to begin with. And I'm suggesting that this is a really healthy governing philosophy for anyone doing anything in the performing arts. Imagine if you only ever heard, Major League Baseball players bitching about all 162 games in their main season because all they really wanted to do was just get that World Series trophy and be done with it. Right? No, that would be absurd. It is a long process that people dedicate to for years. And again, in terms of this process focus and detachment from outcome, Bryan Cranston is far from alone in this view. One of my favorite singers at the Met, mezzo-soprano Isabel Leonard, she's quoted saying, "I've never really concerned myself too much with the outcome of my auditions. I've always kind of understood that sometimes they just need someone else, another kind of person, another kind of singer. So perhaps I've had many failures along the way. I just didn't see them as such." Or you can go back even further. You see, the great Jascha Heifetz saying, "Practice as if your life depended on it and perform as if you don't care," which is really the same message, right? Focus on the process, detach from the outcome. Or let's jump fields again. Let's go back to comedy. I love what Amy Poehler has to say about this.
Being a working actor whom people recognize sometimes means you occasionally get the young up-and-comer who thinks that meeting you is their chance to break in. Good or bad, the reality is most people become famous or get great jobs after a very, very long tenure shoveling shit, and not because they handed their script to someone on the street. Everyone wants to believe that they will be the regular guy from Sioux City who becomes a reluctant movie star despite his best attempts to remain a sensitive tattoo artist. People don't want to hear about the 15 years of waiting tables and doing small shows with your friends until one of them gets a little more famous and they convince people to hire you, and then you get paid and you work hard and spend time getting better and making more connections and friends. Boring. It's much more interesting to believe that every person who makes it in show business just wrote a check to their mother when they were 18 for $1 million with an instruction to cash in a year. Almost every job I've ever gotten was due to someone knowing my work or seeing me in something else. I was in UCB and Andy Richter suggested I do stuff for Conan. Being on Conan helped me land a part in Deuce Bigalow. My UCB television show and Friends helped me get an audition for SNL. My SNL connections resulted in Parks and Recreation. See? Years and years of hard work and little bits of progress isn't nearly as entertaining as imagining me telling a joke in a Boston food court when suddenly Lorne Michaels walks up and says, "I must have you for a little show I do."
She really is one of my favorite comedians, producers, writers. But man, yeah, it's the right message, right? Like top level achievement comes after a long time and like lots of hard work, smart work, deliberate practice. She's basically describing deliberate practice. And like she says, it's not as entertaining, but it's the reality. And so given these two paradigms, right, we are focusing on the healthier one, detaching from an outcome, focusing on the process. Because again, if you're serious about a life in this field, the struggle lasts a long time. Amy Poehler describes it. I have that data from my auditioning chart showing the parallel period, and this takes years. So right, I was a scientist at a nanotech company in Chicago for 10 years while I was kind of putting in that time. And now for the last 8, I've been principal timpanist of the MET Orchestra. I did not attend a conservatory. I do not have a graduate degree in music. And so when I get that kind of question on NPR, my answer, first of all, is, well, deliberate practice. That's how I was able to make this work. I'm going to describe that framework again next week. But to get into this pernicious issue of talent, in case you are thinking, yeah, okay, whatever, this Haaheim guy was just born, freakishly talented. I can assure you that was definitely not the case. Check out my 5th grade report card, if you will. This is from the spring of my 5th grade year, my first year in band, first year playing percussion, where my band teacher, Mrs. Gustafson, accurately assessed that I was weak in one or more areas due to lack of consistent practice. And she was absolutely right. No doubt about it. And in fact, I actually kind of sucked for a long time. And once I got interested in this concept of deliberate practice, years later, I decided to go back and start to try to estimate my lifetime practice hours. Essentially trying to quantify this time span over which I was not good. And it looks like this. And this is really kind of my preferred biography. I think this does tell the more important story. First of all, you can see here that, I began band percussion in 1989, and for the next 7 years, virtually nothing happened. That only changed when I went to summer camp and met a girl and wanted to impress her. It was really that simple. She asked me if I was going to All Star Orchestra, and I lied, and I said yes. And I had no idea what she was talking about. And I asked my friend, and he described to me the situation where, in Minnesota at the time, you would make an audio cassette tape and send it around to judges, and the best students in the state would get selected to spend a week up at Bemidji State playing orchestra rep. And I was like, wow, that sounds fun. Also super hard. Oh my God, like what have I got myself into? So I sought out a percussion teacher for the first time ever really taking percussion lessons. And it was the first time I ever really started applying myself in this. Now, turns out, like, when you're 15, you can get a lot done when you're supercharged on hormones and energy. And I just narrowly made it in to All-State. I got there, recognized that most of these, Minnesota musicians were way beyond where I was, and I had a lot of catching up to do. But I was also really inspired. It was at that point that I kind of started to realize, I think I really like this. Like, I'm going to keep doing this. That led to me, going to a small liberal arts college in the Midwest called Gustavus Adolphus. I was planning to major in physics, and I did. But along the way, I also tacked on my music major also, because I continued loving it. The thing is, at no point along the way here was I thinking like, oh, I'm going to go be, a professional timpanist after this. One of the reasons it didn't even cross my mind is because I was going to Minnesota orchestra concerts at the time. I was seeing, some of these players now that I know well. Players like Peter Kogan on timpani, Jason Arcus in percussion section, Kevin Mount, Brian Watkins, these folks. Brian Mount, Kevin Watkins. There we go. And the point is that I would see them on stage, and to me, they were just like these deities, right? They were like these gods on pedestals, and I didn't have any understanding of this idea of deliberate practice or these kind of flawed assumptions about talent, because I just assumed like, wow, they were born with something that I just don't have. Mrs. Gustafson said so, right? Like, I'm not applying myself. I'm not good. I'm just kind of skating by like as a hobby player. And that idea persisted for a long time. Now, I ended up going to grad school at UC Santa Barbara for electrical engineering. I was in a PhD program. And the next kind of inflection point in this trajectory was me being in grad school, being not like super happy with what I was doing and still wanting to be in music. So I was playing in the university orchestra, and one of my friends there suggested, hey, like, you might really enjoy going to a summer festival. And once again, I had no idea what they were talking about. I was like, what, like Lollapalooza? And they were like, no, like Tanglewood or Aspen or something like that. I thought, I don't know anything. Tell me more. So history kind of repeated itself. And, by the end of it, I was seeking out basically any teacher in Southern California that would take me on for some lessons, made a CD, sent it in. And again, it just narrowly squeaked by. I spent that summer at Aspen having some of these assumptions now undone. And once again, seeing that like these were the students around the country who were very serious about this. And I had a ton of catching up to do. And in fact, like, I've listened to that CD since then, and it is not good, right? I mean, there's no way it would get through today. Like the level has just risen far too much. But when I was out there, I started to see these teachers and the other musicians we were playing with in like the Aspen Festival Orchestra, where the students and teachers get to kind of work side by side. And I was like, oh, these are flesh and blood human beings that show up to rehearsal in, a t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops and sometimes make mistakes. Oh my God, wow, okay. And it was the first time I started to see like this connection, like connecting dots between where I was and maybe theoretically, vaguely, how that could possibly be something I wanted to do. I got back to my graduate degree, just kind of had to admit to myself, my heart's not in it. Like I'm reasonably good at it, but I don't love it. What I really want to do is follow this percussion timpani thing. And at that point, it really was kind of morphing and evolving into timpani. And so that's when I decided to take a job at this tech company in Chicago. was going to give me a way to pay the rent, get some instruments, pay for lessons. And critically, being in Chicago meant that not only did I have access to that scene and the teachers that play in CSO and everything else, but the Civic Orchestra of Chicago was a fantastic training orchestra opportunity. And I'm guessing most of you know it, but it's like New World Symphony or Orchestra Now, kind of an apprenticeship with some of the musicians in the CSO, and a chance to play together with other similarly minded, young aspiring players. And that was this critical period for me. It was along the way there that I sought out who would become one of my most important mentors, this great percussionist and the director of percussion at Indiana University, John Tafoya. And it was in one of those lessons where he said, man, I just read this book called Talent is Overrated. You should check it out. I think it would be right up your alley. And I did. And honestly, it was probably one of the most important books I ever read for reframing, again, my whole approach to what practicing even meant. And it was at that point, from there onward, that final inflection point, I really started to figure out how to practice. And I don't think it's any coincidence that, I started consistently advancing at major auditions about a year and a half after that, and then won the MET audition in 2013. There's a few other main points I want to take away from this more extended graphical biography. I don't think it's any coincidence that it took me many, many thousands of accumulated practice hours before I was even in the running to start consistently advancing at major auditions, right? You've probably heard of the 10,000 hour rule. The 10,000 hour rule is unfortunately named. Malcolm Gladwell kind of made that up in Outliers. It's a totally arbitrary threshold. And in fact, Anders Ericsson wrote his follow-up book, Peak, which I'll talk about in a minute, to try to kind of correct and set the record straight on that. More than anything, it's just a convenient way to encapsulate a huge amount of practice, right? 3 hours a day for 10 years is about 10,000 hours. So it's kind of this rule of thumb, but far from being, a given, right? Also, what is much, much more important than when I started was my trajectory here, right? And you can just see, when I started to get really serious about this and figure out how to practice for myself around 2008, I accomplished more in the next 3 years than I had in the preceding 17. And the third big point here is that I think this should, for anybody, it ought to prompt introspecting questions along the lines of, well, again, for me, it was utterly counterproductive to become too emotionally attached to any of these outcomes along the way. It was much better for my musical development, for auditioning, for life, to focus on the process instead of the product, and just trust that a good process would ultimately yield good results. I didn't know where those were going to be, right? But the question I would want anyone to ask themselves then is not, am I good enough, but rather, am I willing to do the work? And I get it. Like, we're all desperate for the validation that comes from that first question. Like, you want to go to a teacher you respect and sort of stand before the oracle and just say, like, am I going to make it? And you want them to say yes. The reality is nobody can tell you that. We don't have crystal balls, right? And again, relating to the theme of, like, this is going to take time, and, like, my chart shows that. The second question is then this: if you put yourself in the position of just having finished school, for instance, maybe you're 22, maybe you're 42. Now imagine yourself 10 years further down the road. In 10 years down the road, you still haven't made it, right? The way Mark Maron and Cranston were sort of describing, however you define success, this is a loaded word, but however you define it, whether full-time orchestra job, teaching, chamber musician, touring soloist, premiering a bunch of new music works, like however you define this, it still hasn't happened, right? You're still working part-time in other capacities to pay the bills, and you've been expending massive time and energy, deliberate practicing, and it hasn't worked out yet. So the question I would put to you is, will it have been worth it? And this really relates to the idea of sustainable commitment. Will it have been fulfilling? Will it have been rewarding? on its own terms. Will your life have been enriched as a result of your efforts, regardless of the outcome? And again, success is a loaded word. It means different things to different people. In my case, if I had never won the MET, if I'd never won anything, I really believe and hope that I would not have considered myself a failure. Right? I had a good life in Chicago. I had my tech job. I was practicing. I was freelancing with a bunch of different orchestras. It was fun. It was fundamentally fulfilling. And I always keep reminding myself, like, none of this was preordained, right? I absolutely don't claim to be special simply because I won this big orchestra job. I am constantly reminding myself it could have easily gone so many other different ways, right? I was getting to finals somewhat regularly, and I put in enough good work that I felt like there was a decent chance of something happening, but it was not a guarantee. And even if I won something, it could have just as easily been one of the $30,000 a year orchestra auditions that I took in the year leading up to the MET. There is a lot of randomness in this life. And there's the good work you can do and the process you can control, and then the outcomes you have to detach from after that. Like I said already, I'm really opposed to this sort of like mono singular definition of success. I am opposed to this fallacy of the pure artist that says, like, you can only be considered a real artist or a real musician if you dedicate only to this and check these boxes and get these outcomes or results. So many of the musicians I deeply respect the most are well-rounded and diversely skilled and interested in a lot of things and interesting people, which kind of gets the heart of willpower and resilience. And as we'll see, I'll talk about this again more in detail next week, but these are absolutely necessary qualities to cultivate for this long haul. There's a lot of research that shows that a key component of the qualities of willpower and resilience is a feeling of agency, that you are making your own decisions rather than just being buffeted about by fate or change or parental expectations or any of these things, right? So it has everything to do then with commitment and avoiding burnout. And ultimately, with that kind of long-term satisfaction, you'll be able to derive from the process of it. It's weird to say that we're at this point where, like, things are bad enough at the Metropolitan Opera, like it could collapse, right? Like it could just collapse and be no more, or kind of like turn into this like freelance per service orchestra. And that would be sad and tragic. But when I'm honest with myself, like, I look back, I'm like, yeah, will it have been worth it? Absolutely. And I'll figure out something else to do, right? It's about the joy of actually doing the work, because I really firmly believe that doing the work is the measure of your commitment to the art form. It's not the rewards, it's not the accolades, it's not all that stuff. That is ephemeral. And the work is deliberate practice. So before we dive into the deliberate practice framework, I was sort of saying we have to also tackle this other persistent myth, the myth of innate talent, right? To put it generously, talent is overrated. To put it more bluntly, innate talent is a myth, and one that, especially over the last year, I've begun to realize is kind of toxic for reasons we can discuss toward the end. So I want to start unpacking this. With deliberate practice, the goal is not just to reach your potential, which is, again, a kind of flawed concept that you have a fixed potential, but rather to build it, to make possible things that were not possible before. These quotes are coming from Anders' book, Peak. Now, the fallacy of the old notion of talent is that you have some sort of innate potential that you reach and then it's like static. That's nonsense, right? You are in charge of the height of that potential. Think about a historical anecdote here for a second. The 4-minute mile, right? So Roger Bannister was the first human to beat the 4-minute mile in 1954. Since then, thousands have done even better. I want to say that the record is currently something like 3 minutes and 47 seconds, or something really astonishing. But the question is, starting in say the late 30s. Were humans just all of a sudden born with more innate running talent than previous generations? Like what, like bigger quadriceps and, tougher, like bones and feet? Like, no, that's not the way evolution works. It's kind of ludicrous when you frame it that way. What changed is that somebody figured out a better and smarter way to train and then demonstrated it could be done. And people after that were like, oh, I want to be a fast runner. Let me ask Roger how he trained. Like, how did he do this? And people started emulating and improving and incrementally pushing the bar, right? So, right, you're in charge of the height of your own potential. Moreover, in the book, Anders says a very important thing. It is one of the most enduring and deep-seated of all beliefs about human nature that natural talent plays a major role in determining ability. But when you actually study this and you study experts in a variety of different fields, you get a very different explanation where deliberate practice plays the starring role. Expert performers develop their extraordinary abilities through years and years of dedicated practice, improving step by step in a long, laborious process. And again, sort of my whole premise of this is that a lot of people do that process ad hoc, piecemeal, kind of by accident. And what Anders figured out is that the people doing this at a high level have a fairly consistent methodology for how they go about it. There are no shortcuts. Various sorts of practice can get something done, but the most effective is what he called deliberate practice. It takes advantage of the natural adaptability of the human brain, something through neuroscience we now know is called neuroplasticity. So it takes advantage of this to create new abilities. Most of these abilities are created with the help of detailed mental representations, something you may not have even heard of before. We're going to really unpack that next week. But it allows us to analyze and respond to situations much more effectively than we could otherwise. So when I do sessions like this, it's been changing over the last few years, but a lot of people encounter this material having assumed, at least partially, that natural talent plays a major role in people's lives. As he says in the book, it's this enduring sort of deep-seated belief about human nature. So if you've been part of kind of thinking that way, like I understand this is a pretty major bit of rewiring. It might be taking a fairly substantial part of how you've understood the world and kind of turning it upside down. So I'm saying it because it's an essential paradigm shift. I want to spend a little more time unpacking it, and I want to take on another sort of bit of anti-vocabulary almost, and that is prodigies. I think this is another unhelpful word, or at least the way it gets used in our field, because I don't believe in them, and neither does Erickson. And what I mean by that is it's that there's no evidence to support their existence in the first place. Or the word prodigy needs to be completely redefined. Can there be, highly accomplished young people? Certainly. But it's important to understand how they got that way. Not because they were born with some sort of prodigious talent, but rather because they had unusual access to extremely high level and intense training from a very, very early age. They were still doing deliberate practice. Moreover, there is a dark side to believing in innate talent. And we're going to talk about this more toward the end, because I think this is something useful to discuss in a kind of Q&A format. But to begin with, you get the danger of this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? He says, when people assume that talent plays a major or even determining role in how accomplished a person can become, that assumption points towards certain actions. If you assume that people who are not innately gifted are never going to be good at something, then, for instance, children who don't excel at something right away are encouraged to give it up and try something else. And think of how kind of sad and fundamentally unfair that is, especially for kids who don't have, the agency to be accountable for their own understanding of talent, right? You just tell a kid like, hey, sorry, you don't got it. Like, you should quit piano. Well, you've kind of killed that kid's potential future. And why? Based on what? It it relates to this issue of kind of flawed gatekeeping that I'm going to bring up later. But consider then the flip side, right? There's another danger to this. You tell somebody like, okay, you're the chosen one, right? Maybe a violin prodigy, maybe like our little image here of Anakin Skywalker wielding a lightsaber. Like, it's not always helpful to do that. It's, first of all, it's wrong. And there's a very real chance that, you know, they'll stop working as hard because they'll just coast thinking like, well, I've already got talent, or they'll burn out, or they'll feel entitled, or they'll become a heinous Sith Lord. You never know how this is going to go, but it's not helpful. And again, part of the reason I'm really invested in teaching this stuff is because this is where this research can have important impacts, right? As we'll later see, like, experts are terrible at predicting talent. Teachers, gatekeepers, you know, you would think that if this were in fact some sort of like natural, innate, measurable thing, first of all, we would have found a way to measure it by this point, because just think of how, like, the incentives. Imagine if you could identify a young genius level stock market talent. Well, Goldman Sachs has all the money in the world. They would just invest in all these kids, hire them all to work for the fund, you know, and then boom, that's it. But it just doesn't work that way. Again, whether it's picking stocks or football or tennis or chess or timpani or neurosurgery or literally anything else, like, no one has the ability to look at a young, inexperienced person who has not yet put in these tens of thousands of hours of practice and then accurately predict their outcome based on anything innate. So even by itself, that alone ought to be enough to kind of disprove this idea of natural talent. But let's keep going. You can't extrapolate too much when somebody picks something up quickly. You know, there are always these obvious differences in how quickly different people pick something up. Anyone who teaches, like, I see that in especially young students. But because we see differences in beginners, it's sort of, we make this mistaken assumption that those differences persist, that the same people who did well in the beginning will just continue to breeze through all the way. And we imagine that these lucky people were born with innate talents that created that and smoothed the way and are leading them to excel. It's an understandable result of sort of observing the beginning of something and extrapolating, and it's also totally wrong. For instance, the more psychologists study IQ, it's like the less they understand about it, and it's fraught, and there are a lot of there's different cultural baggage that gets involved with how we even test it. So I need to acknowledge that is a sort of problematic area already. But to the extent it means anything at all, it's been correlated with people picking up things more quickly. But interestingly, people who pick things up more slowly are forced to practice more to keep up. More practice forms better mental representations. Again, this thing we're going to discuss next week. And over time, the people with the best mental representations and the most intense practice ethic will tend to persevere. There's another example about the self-fulfilling prophecy here. If you may have heard this, it's a kind of famous study from Canadian hockey. But in Canada, many more professional hockey players are born in January through March than in October through December. It is classically called the cutoff problem. And it results from the fact that you have to be a certain age by December 31st to make whatever, league in Pee Wee hockey. So the children born in January through March are the oldest ones in their team or in their league. At the age of 4 or 5 or 6, this can result in a striking advantage in terms of physical development, right? You might be taller, bigger, heavier, more coordinated. The coach might then see these older kids that appear to be more talented than the others. And so then they're given more opportunities for starting or getting better coaching or whatever. But when you step back and you look at it, you're like, oh, well, no, there's obviously nothing more innately talented about the month you're born in. It's just the self-fulfilling prophecy at work. There's another angle to this that is kind of about this extrapolation thing, but I call it the Mario Kart principle for anyone that's played this classic Nintendo racing game. If you haven't, don't worry. It's one of these things where you have these tracks you race through and you have different characters that you can choose from. And the characters balance things like, agility and acceleration and top speed. And in the game, the guy on the left, Toad, he is agile and he accelerates quickly. But Bowser has a much higher top speed. And if you practice with Bowser, if you put in a lot of time to develop these sophisticated mental maps of the tracks, mental representations, being able to anticipate all of the turns and all of this, well, at that point, then acceleration and agility sort of become irrelevant. And you can start to dominate the people playing as Toad. Playing as Toad is easy, right? You can make mistakes, you can recover. It's easy to lose focus. You can kind of coast. Playing as Bowser is really tough. Like, it's punching. There's very little room for error. It makes you really hone your game. You can see where I'm going with this, right? The analogy should be clear enough. Taking to it easily can actually lull you into the fallacy of thinking you're not going to have to work that hard or develop the skills or form these mental maps. There's a similar example that's been studied in chess. So when researchers were looking at chess grandmasters, they were expecting to find a correlation between IQ and grandmaster tournament level performance. And they did, right? Except it was the opposite of what they expected. They were expecting to go in and see, high IQ and the top grandmasters in the world. And actually they found it was the opposite. And that was surprising. But when they went back to really pick apart the results, they started to see exactly what Erickson was talking about. This counterintuitive result hinges upon, again, the understanding of what's really going on here. Sure, people can pick things up quickly, but that's a short-term phenomenon linked to short-term memory. How much impact does this have over the long run? Very little, right? Like the 8 to 10 to 15 years it takes to achieve the expertise and mastery to be a chess grandmaster. So what they found was that like a lower IQ, like not picking it up quickly, actually conferred the slight advantage because it forced students in like middle school chess club to focus better and practice harder and study more of the game. And this is then critical for developing these mental representations. And another thing we'll talk about next we call domain-specific knowledge. And it's these things upon which chess mastery really depends. So over time then, the lower IQ players build up more sophisticated mental representations, better practicing, and tend to do better in the long run. Interesting is that other studies have then shown similar results in other fields. So should be easy enough to see that if it can apply to chess grandmasters, other fields, it applies to Mario Kart, it definitely applies to musicians. So we're talking about then sort of realigning our mindset to reject at least 3 of these prevailing myths. The first is the belief that one's abilities are limited by one's genetically prescribed characteristics. It's wrong. As we've seen, the right sort of practice can help pretty much anyone improve in just about any area they choose to focus on. We can shape our own potential. Now, I should say that in the research in Anders' book and everything, they do go out of their way to highlight sort of the exceptions that prove the rule, which is if it's something like basketball and height has a major effect on playing the game, well, yeah, that is a genetic characteristic that's going to matter. But these exceptions turn out to be extremely rare. So the second myth, if you do something for long enough, you're bound to get better at it. That's also false, right? Like doing the same thing over and over again mindlessly is not a recipe for improvement. It's basically a recipe for stagnation. And 3, then, okay, fine. All it takes to improve is effort. If you just try hard, you'll get better. That's also not really it. Like these are specialized skills that we're trying to develop as musicians. And unless you're practicing techniques specifically designed to improve those skills, if you're just trying hard, that's not going to get you very far. So the deliberate practice mindset offers this different view. Anyone can improve, but it requires the right approach. And if you're not improving, it's not because you lack talent, it's because you're not practicing the right way, and that can change. So it's a huge emphasis then of these sessions for us to explore these most efficient ways to practice. Because again, it's not enough to do it a lot. It's not enough to try hard. You've got to try hard for thousands of hours and then be smart and efficient about it. Nevertheless, you will still doubtless encounter people in your life like this. How do you draw so well? Practice. Oh, well, it must be an innate gift. No, it's practice. I'll never understand how some people are so talented. What a mystery. It's practice, right? This is a comic strip by Sarah Anderson, great comic artist. But it's a little bit more in my personality to offer pushback on this, but it's something, I get this from friends, family, audience members at the Met, like, oh, Jason, that performance was marvelous. What wonderful musical gifts you have. And I'm just kind of like, it annoys me. And it's not unlike this other anecdote from Anders' book, Peak. Basketball legend Ray Allen was quoted as saying, I've argued this with a lot of people in my life. When people say, God blessed me with a beautiful jump shot, it really pisses me off. He tells these people, don't undermine the work I've put in every day. Not some days, every day. Ask anyone who's been on a team with me, who's out there shooting the most. And that resonates with me, because from this other perspective, then it's kind of insulting. It's almost demeaning, and it devalues the real work that you put in. The darker flip side, again, is that it's very easy for people to assume they'll never be good at a thing if they think they have not gotten that blessing or that gift. It can be kind of an underhanded excuse at that point. Even somebody like Stephen King says, yeah, talent is cheaper than table salt. What separates talented individual from the successful one is a lot of hard work. Or let's go even to somebody who was good friends with one of the most iconic geniuses in history, Albert Einstein, right? A lot of people, when they're thinking about explaining talent or genius and all this, are like, well, I mean, come on, like Einstein was clearly born that way. One of Einstein's best friends was, sure enough, Suzuki, who said there is no such thing as inherited talent. There is no such thing as inherited genius. There's no such thing as inborn musical talent. So instead, we're really talking about the doctrine of continuous improvement. And that in pretty much any area of human endeavor, people have a tremendous capacity to improve their performance as long as they train the right way. You keep going, getting better and better and better, and how much you improve then is ultimately up to you. The reason you have to put in tens of thousands of hours is because the people with whom you're competing have also themselves put in that much or more time. Because there's no point at which performance maxes out and additional practice does not lead to further improvement. And again, it's a weird thing when you kind of pick apart that idea of having a fixed potential and you just like reach it and you're done. Like as musicians, we intuitively understand that is just not true. Like you're never done getting better. You can always refine something more. So they say that, right, in the research to date, they have found no limitations to the improvements that can be made with particular types of practice. As training techniques are improved and new heights of achievement are discovered, people in every area of human endeavor are constantly finding ways to get better. There's no sign that will stop. It's a fundamentally encouraging message. Honestly, it's a fundamentally encouraging message, especially after the last kind of year that we've experienced. So again, to kind of summarize this, the old school approach is like, yeah, your potential is fixed by mysterious genetic forces and you just work to reach it. But what Anders and the rest of the research community are saying is that your potential evolves as you do, constantly being redefined by the work you put in. And you know, when I started saying new school, I almost literally mean new schooling. Because one of the interesting things that I've found is that the resistance to these ideas is sometimes stronger in the most elite music schools. Whereas when I've given talks and seminars like this to high school music educators, they're kind of like, oh yeah, no, we get that. Like we study Carol Dweck's mindset book in our music ed courses, talking about the growth mindset over the fixed mindset. This is an important, another kind of groundbreaking piece of work in psychology, where the thesis of her book is that, most of humanity has been mired in the fixed mindset for most of history. And that's the idea that our potential is preset, genetically predetermined, fixed by fate, whatever. But we're discovering how wrong that is. And what takes its place is this thing called the growth mindset. It's basically depending on deliberate practice. She writes in the book, the view you adopt for yourself affects the way you lead your life. The growth mindset asserts that a person's true potential is unknown. It's unknowable. That it's impossible to foresee what can be accomplished with years of passion, toil, and training. If you go back and you think about my chart where I had all these accumulating practice hours, I had a lot of teachers along the way. And the remarkable thing is, like, if you would have gone back and asked them at any point in time, 1989, 1994, 1999, 2004, most of these points along the way, if you'd ask them, hey, is this kid, Jason, going to end up at the Metropolitan Opera someday? They'd be like, no, what are you talking about? Like, yeah, he's having fun doing this, but like, he's not applying himself. He's got no chance. He doesn't have the talent. The growth mindset creates a passion for learning rather than a hunger for approval. Its hallmark is the conviction that human qualities like intelligence, creativity, and even relational capacities like love and friendship can be cultivated through effort and deliberate practice. So this has all obviously had a huge impact on my own teaching philosophy. I don't like the idea of nurturing talent. I like rewarding those who have chosen work ethic, because I think students' reframed concept of talent can then forge confidence throughout any of the rest of their studies in truly any other areas, disciplines, regardless of the field. And that reframed concept of talent then can join with a process focus to become truly life-changing. That's what it was for me. Back in around 2007, when I kind of made this decision that I was going to stop obsessing about specific outcomes and instead refocus on the process that was under my control, that process of deliberate practice and refining my craft. That was huge, and that was really where the rubber starts to meet the road in terms of how you onboard this stuff. Because again, to this day, it remains kind of a baffling thing that in my physics education, our physics professors gave us assignments telling us what we had to learn, but they also guided us on how to learn it. Not just how to read these inscrutable textbooks, but also how to work the problems, how to navigate the lab sections and like not light everything on fire, and how to problem solve, and ultimately how to think like physicists. And that's why it remains strange to me that so much of music pedagogy has still barely moved beyond the what. As we said at the top, as Peter kind of set up, nearly all music students are told what to practice in lessons and curriculum, but very few are coached on how to practice with maximum efficiency, which is crazy when you consider how this is like the main thing that we actually need to do in our craft. So there's a science to this now. It's called The Science of Expertise. This is the book that Anders wrote with his co-author, Robert Poole. And again, just to remind you, I really believe that it was my training in science, kind of paradoxically, that predisposed me to figure this stuff out and then increase my rate of improvement faster than many of my conservatory trained competitors in the timpani audition circuit. So I've mentioned this book, Peak, a lot. I've mentioned Talent is Overrated. If you're interested, there are a lot of others in this series, right? Talent is Overrated is the first one that came out. There's also The Talent Code. I recommend it, by Daniel Coyle. Bounce is also really interesting, by Matthew Syed. And then Peak came out in 2016. I think it's interesting to highlight these because what often happens in science is that researchers will figure out some interesting questions to ask at some point, and a sort of little sub-discipline will develop. And then over time, 5, 10, 15 years maybe, they start to get some results and some conclusions, and some consensus starts to emerge. And at that time, the more interesting these results are, and the more the consensus can be established through research, there are often sort of journalists hovering around this and feeling like, okay, is there something here where we can write a book and translate this for a mass audience? And once you start to get multiples of books like this, that's kind of an indication that like, oh, there's been an avalanche of research that's led to some of these very firm conclusions. So that's, I think, one of the things you can see here. And in a way, these books are all summarizing the same big body of research. They have a lot of different interesting anecdotes to illustrate it, but they all are saying very similar things. Same basic theses and same basic implications. I'm going to run through those now as we're wrapping up, and then we're going to really start to dissect this framework and methodology at the next session. So first big thing they say is, yeah, expert level performance in any discipline requires this smart hard work, deliberate practice, and putting in many thousands of hours of it. Nothing special about 10,000. It's just 3 hours a day for 10 years. Tens of thousands of hours of deliberate practice doesn't guarantee success. Nobody can promise you that. What it does guarantee is that you will improve dramatically. Next, innate talent, if it even exists, becomes irrelevant over the timescale necessary to achieve mastery. Now, we have to caveat that because, as scientists, we're always very careful to say, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You can't prove a negative. It could be that 10, 15, 20 years from now, there is some gene isolated that points to some tendency or something else. But I think the more important point is that we already know enough to say that if there are even any of these like little helpful head starts in the beginning, it becomes irrelevant next to the scale of what it takes to actually do this over the long run. And let me really dive into that then, because what this came from, the very first paper that Anders published about this in 1993, it's where the term deliberate practice came from, was looking at violinists in a long-range study at the Berlin Academy. And again, they kind of went in with assumptions that the professors were going to be able to predict talent, and then they were going to follow it and see what was going on with it. And what they found was quite the opposite. They found that the professors were terrible at predicting these long-term outcomes. And then when they looked at the study, the only real correlating factors with, differentiating these groups of violinists who, went on to do, good, successful teaching and all of that versus the ones who like landed jobs in major orchestras versus those that were, like world-class soloists touring around playing with, Berlin Phil, Chicago Symphony, whatever. The differences were how much they practiced, but really specifically what kind of practice it was and how they had designed their practice. And that was when Ericsson began to realize, oh, there is a common methodology for how the people at the most elite level are approaching this and not just going in to shed mindless hours. So the other big point here, and this example comes up in some of the other books, but people will talk about Einstein. It's like, well, how do you explain Einstein? In our field, of course, people will say, well, what about Mozart? Like, how do you explain Mozart as, according to this deliberate practice model? Clearly, Mozart was a born genius. I actually welcome that discussion because I think, to the contrary, Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus, is a ideal case study for the model of deliberate practice. There's been a lot of really wonderful musicological research done in the last 50 years that has kind of debunked a lot of the myth that grew up around Mozart. And for a little taste of this, I'm going to read you a passage from something Alex Ross wrote in the New Yorker a few years ago. He says, scholars have demolished the old idea that Mozart was an idiot savant, transcribing the music that played in his brain. Instead, he seems to have refined his ideas to an almost manic degree. Examination of Mozart's surviving sketches and drafts reveals that the composer sometimes began a piece, set it aside, and resumed it months or years later, rewrote troubling sections several times in a row, started movements from scratch when a first attempt failed to satisfy, and waited to finish an aria until a singer had tried out the opening. Musicologist Ulrich Conrad calls these stockpiles of material departure points, a delineation of intellectual places to which Mozart could return as necessary. In other words, the music in Mozart's mind may have been like a huge map of half-explored territories, In a way, he was writing all his works all of the time. So the new image of him as a kind of improvising perfectionist is even more formidable than the previous kind of flawed myth of God's stenographer. Alex Ross goes on to say, ambitious parents who are currently playing the baby Mozart videos for their toddlers may be disappointed to learn that Mozart became Mozart by working furiously hard. So already, that sounds a lot like deliberate practice to me. But let's dig a little deeper on this. If you recall the year Mozart was born, 1756, then consider something like the 14th Piano Concerto in E-flat major. This is Tertial 449, composed in 1784. And many musicologists will point to that or sort of adjacent works as being one of his first mature works, or defining his kind of mature period. And when you think about that, for any of us who have encountered really early Mozart, it's kind of schlock, right? It's very derivative. If that's all we had to work from, he would not be remembered as Mozart. History would not have remembered that stuff. You go later, and certainly, my gosh, we still perform the great operas like Don Giovanni and Così fan tutte and Die Zauberflöte and Marriage Figaro at the Met regularly. But if you think about it for a second, okay, so how old was Mozart then when he composed the first thing history would really bother to remember? You can see where I'm going with this, right? The point is that mastery takes a long time, even for Mozart. The musicologist Neil Zasov wrote this important essay called Mozart as a Working Stiff. And in it, he recounts this exchange between Wolfgang and his musical colleague, Georg Friedrich Richter, where Mozart was demonstrating this passage on the piano. And Richter exclaimed, "Oh, good God, how hard I work and sweat and yet win no applause. And, to you, my friend, it's all child's play." Basically saying, well, wow, Mozart, what a gift you were given. And Mozart pushes back. He's like, whoa, hold on. Yes, I too had to work hard so as to not have to work hard any longer, so as to make it look easy. Right? Mozart's basically saying, dude, it only looks easy because I worked my ass off. And this was actually from Mozart's own pen in a letter to his father in 1784, the same year he wrote the 14th Piano Concerto. He was 28 years old. He was 28 years old when he finished that. And yet he started studying from the age of 4 with his father, Leopold, who was arguably one of the leading musical pedagogues in Europe at the time. By that measure, Mozart put in 24 years of deliberate practice before he produced anything that history would really bother to remember, consider great. If anything, he was kind of behind the curve, right? And I say that not glibly, right? I think there are some real problems, obviously, in our industry with genius worship. I'll leave that for a minute, but I'll acknowledge that Mozart, call it genius, call it whatever, he was exceptionally skilled and an incredibly excellent composer. But his genius was not gifted; it was earned. It was earned, and that's the really key point. We're going to dive then into all of these attributes in the framework of deliberate practice next week at the second session. For now, though, to wrap up and to let me a couple tangible takeaways and sort of action items almost for you, if you will, to summarize what we've talked about. Post a sign in your studio, your practice room, wherever. Talent is overrated. Here, we reward work ethic. Continually remind yourself or your students that talent is earned. It's not gifted. Begin focusing on, not one-off accomplishments or outcomes that are not fully under your control, but rather your process of deliberate practice. Remember that deliberate practice is a universally applicable process across many different fields and disciplines. And that quality time spent with your instrument now can confer and evolve these versatile skills. Practicing is itself a very important skill. If you're a younger orchestral track student, remember that audition success takes multiple years. And for anybody, start strategizing how to make this time as sustainable as possible. It doesn't always have to be pure artistry. There is no shame in doing other odd jobs and cultivating other skills to be able to pay the bills. And considering that long road, right, ask yourself not, am I good enough right now, but rather, am I willing to do the work? Now, I want to go back for a second, because as wrapping this up, I think it's also really essential to just, for a final statement, to clarify a concept about the myth of innate talent and opportunity and access, and also how this relates to social justice. Because innate talent might be a myth. That's what I'm saying. But does that mean that everybody has an equally fair shot? I am going to categorically and unequivocally say absolutely not. Okay. This has obviously been true for decades in the United States, many places around the world, but it's really been right up on our nose this past year. I mean, Derek Chauvin is currently on trial in my hometown of Minneapolis. Dante Wright was just killed in my hometown again by another police officer. The cycle continues, right? And an underlying truth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is, measurably the largest movement in history, is that this oppression is structural and systemic. And decades and reams of data reveal this to anyone willing to look. The United States in particular is not a land of equally fair shots, and it never has been. And especially in our field, we need to disabuse ourselves of this notion, because this past year has also been a real reckoning in the performing arts in so many ways. Institutions, very much including the Met, are riddled with systemic racism, systemic misogyny, gatekeeping, havens for abuse of power. Some of you may have seen in the wake of the announcement of James Levine's death, a lot of people still being out there, oh, but his artistry, and I'm losing my mind with this. He sexually assaulted minors for decades. The Met's board and management covered for him, and to this day, none of his enablers have been fired. No one has even been officially reprimanded. I mention this again, not as a rant, but to highlight that pervasive unaccountability maintains privilege, and it remains not a fair shot. And so for me, the last year has also been this stream of constant parallels between the way I conceive of practicing and expertise and cultivating expert performance, and then the wider world events around us. I actually believe a very critical aspect of all of this relates to deliberate practice. It has everything to do with the lies we tell ourselves, right? As Americans, we told ourselves a host of lies that are kind of being torn down in fairly rapid succession. Next week, I'll talk more about something like self-recording, which I think is important, and at an individual level, how in the practice room, specific to our own musicianship, we often tell ourselves lies too. Our ego gets in the way. We're often unwilling to confront the sort of reality that might be revealed by recording yourself and listening back. In my teaching, I've encountered folks who are justifiably skeptical of my deliberate practice message, and the critique kind of goes like this. Great, this Haaheim guy is just yet another white male elitist telling us the reason we're not successful is that we're not working hard enough. Basically like the bootstraps myth, right? And honestly, I really empathize with where people are coming from. I am a product of massive privilege. I'm keenly aware that my skin color and gender identity and sexual orientation made my path easier in this field. There's just absolutely no denying that. But also, like I've mentioned, success is a loaded word. And specific to the methodology of deliberate practice and the application of the scientific method to craft refinement, I am not claiming that all you need to be successful is hard work, because any kind of success, however you define it for yourself, will require opportunity and resources. And it is just glaringly, painfully obvious that far too many Americans lack basic opportunity and basic resources. Pursuing instrumental music, it requires at a minimum an instrument, a teacher, access to broader training infrastructures. All of these things cost money. And so as wages have stagnated, this threshold of access has been getting higher and higher and higher. And as I really believe as performing artists, we cannot shy away from that reality. Because for people who are out of reach of that, that's not their fault. That is a societal failing. So I think it's important to have this kind of asterisk around this notion of talent and deliberate practice, because we have to acknowledge a minimum threshold of resources and access is required in the United States just to even kind of play the game. And we have so much work to do to ensure equal access to those resources. But then once we're in the game and over this long time scale, the efficacy of deliberate practice asserts the leading role. That's really what Erickson is trying to say in his research. So like I said, we will dig into that next week. We'll really unpack that whole framework and the methodology of it. And I want to thank you for your time and attention, and kind of leave this for a discussion if you guys want to stick around, because I think one of the interesting questions that might arise in this is, why has this talent myth been so persistently enduring? But again, if you are interested in discussing that, stick around. I've also got this Deliberate Practice Bootcamp, like Peter mentioned, happening in June, so you can check that out if you want. And again, thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, Jason. This is just really fantastic. Really, really great.
Thank you.
Just so many things to chew on, and all the myth busting, I think is really something I've been chewing on a lot too. So I just wanted to say to those of you who have to head out, thanks for being here. I've put in the chat a link to Jason and his website and our website. I want to encourage you to make a donation if you're able, so that we can help support artists by paying them for their work. And also I'm putting in the chat right now upcoming presentations that we're doing, including next week. So Jason's going to do a follow-up next week on Thursday, like he mentioned. The links for all of those are in the chat. So I would love to dive into this question that you have, and I'm sure that you'd be open for other questions that people who have.
Please,
either to
any questions
unmute themselves or put in the chat, or however you're most comfortable. Do you want to ask your question again, just so?
So I think, and this is something that I am genuinely curious about, because there's not a lot that I have found in the research literature to get into the why, kind of sociologically, this has been such an enduring myth. It's just sort of in his book, Erickson kind of states this is like it's there, but really over the last year, I've thought like there's more to this. There's more to this at the level of like why the talent myth has been so persistently enduring, and how that relates maybe to some of these other systemic problems that we see. This is where, for me, it gets much more speculative, and I'm sort of brainstorming. But there have been, again, in the last years, I've done sessions like this. I think a lot of really interesting discussions and dialogue around this, and how it relates, to ourselves personally, to our careers, to our colleagues, to the institutions we inevitably find ourselves a part of. And so that's one area where I'm just curious to know what folks think.
There's a message in the chat. I definitely feel the hero musician myth we've built around Mozart and Beethoven's feed into the myth of talent that becomes toxic for education, for sure.
I don't know if you folks saw this, but there was, it was in the New York Times. I'm forgetting exactly where it was, but the title of the article was basically like, the era of genius worship must stop. And it was specifically talking about James Levine. And, that is something I can speak to, because I was a part of that environment. I saw how absolutely toxic it has been at the Met, and how it's enabled that. And one of the questions that we encounter a lot for any of us in the MET Orchestra, but certainly I think anyone in our field, I always look at that, and there's the hero worship takes on this self-perpetuating assumption, right? If you assume somebody has talent, then you have to give them these opportunities, and then it feeds itself, and they have more opportunities, and all of this. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And one of the interesting ways to think about the self-fulfilling prophecy is, like, who else might have done great work in that position at the Met for 40 years, right? Given a virtually infinite budget and like free reign, and because there are other things about the Met that have not been like super widely publicized, but this also isn't confidential or secret. It's just like well known at this point that Levine kept other good conductors from coming to the Met. Like he also created, it's many of you might know that the Met Orchestra is sort of like a double orchestra. We have like double principals, and we do 7 performances a week in a normal season. And what Levine ended up doing was kind of creating his orchestra, the A orchestra, and then anytime guests would show up, they got the B orchestra. Now, not only did this create incredible internal friction within and resentment, understandably, within the players, but critics would come and be like, wow, there's just something Levine does to get the magic of the sound, and other guest conductors just don't have it, right? And I'm like, it's like the Wizard of Oz. Like, come on, And I also, very, very much, Jade, to your point about the sort of hero musician, we've very much as an institution lived through the toxic effects of that. And I sometimes get wistful when I think of like what it could have been if other non-horrifically abusive people had been in that position. Let's see here. We've got another one from Stephen. I'm just going to read it. Loved it as a professional scientist. Everything you suggest rings true about long-term success, but nothing substitutes for a love of the chosen vocation. So many of the young prodigies who were rapidly clever as children seem to disappear over time. Love and dedication is key, whether or not you succeed in terms of so many other metrics. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, I think of that as like doing the work is the measure of the commitment, right? Like, and it's it's really hard to do that work over the long haul if you don't really love it. I'll talk a little more next week too about how I think a lot of aspiring people in different disciplines too, not just music, think that like because you love it, it's going to be easy or joyful. And I think a lot of us understand like that's not the reality. Like it is actually often quite excruciating. It's difficult. It's gratifying, but it's really, really hard. And just loving it doesn't make it automatically easy. Let's see, right. Perhaps we're fascinated by celebrities. Certainly there's a lot to that in the endurance of innate talent. I'm curious for anyone in here who teaches, you've probably encountered the same thing where you're working with young players. You see this kind of like some people pick it up easier than others. I was doing some teaching before I encountered the research on deliberate practice, and very much I myself fell into that trap of just like, oh, they picked it up quick. They're more talented. Just like we could do a digital show of hands or something, but is that a common experience for folks in here too? I see Peter, you're nodding. Yeah. Yeah. We also see plenty of instances in music education where the self-fulfilling prophecy is at work. We have our own versions of the sort of Canadian hockey example. There's another one that's interesting to me, and I've heard this in different like history and sociology contexts referred to as the pyramids problem. And that is that when, there's sort of like the longstanding myth that like, oh, the Egyptian pyramids must have been made by aliens, right? And that like ancient cultures were like, oh, they were created by gods or something, because they couldn't imagine how it was possible for human beings to accomplish this. And obviously the reality was it was difficult and it took a long time and it literally depended on slave labor. But when you have the full picture, it's like, oh yeah, you get the rocks from here, it's hundreds of years, you build it up and, you make this big thing. But just looking at it, I imagine being some, pre-modern wanderer or explorer, you come across these in the desert, you're like, this makes no sense. Like this is beyond explanation. And, I can imagine how, like, if I didn't have the background of this research to draw upon, in high school, I played tennis, not well, right? Like I never really even made it much beyond the junior varsity squad, but I enjoyed it. Like I kind of know how to play, but lacking any of this other background, I would look at somebody like Roger Federer or Venus Williams or, Rafael Nadal and be like, well, that is inexplainable. Like, of course they must be talented, because I'm effectively looking at the sports incarnation of a pyramid. I'm like, I have no way to explain this. We've probably encountered that in different fields too. It's sort of, again, almost in a way, Peter, like you were describing the black box. Like practicing can seem like a black box, and you're like, well, it's magic. I guess it's just magic in there.
For sure. For sure. We have another question in the chat. How did your teachers inspire you and you inspire yourself to keep going during the arid times? Few opportunities to play, few auditions available, financial setbacks. I think that's
a really good question.
One of the keys.
I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in depth next week, but I'll kind of give you the sneak peek. I would say on the first point of like teachers inspiring me, I think it was really important that I saw. I mean, so first of all, I was in this position where I was sort of like auditioning my teachers rather than the other way around, because I wasn't part of a school. I was like a free agent, and I could just go around and find the person that I thought was going to be the best fit, as long as they were willing to have me. And so I got, I had some kind of specific criteria I was looking for in a teacher, and almost like a litmus test. And I'd go in and play something, and if they demonstrated something, I was like, oh, like cool, like what made you arrive at that? If their answer was something like, well, that's just how it's done, or that's what my teacher told me, I'm like, okay, good enough. And in my journal or my lesson recording on the way home, I'd be like, yeah, this is probably not like the relationship that's going to work for me. But if they said something like, oh, well, man, so glad you asked, because it like relates to this kind of methodology of how I think about this and technique, but then the emotional expression and how it relates to this part of the score and kind of the story we're trying to tell. I'm like, now we're dealing with somebody who thinks in like frameworks and kind of wants to have this collaborative effort to get me thinking that way so I can solve most of these problems myself. That I found very inspiring. And it was these same teachers who were not doing the, like, you're talented, you're going to make it or not. They were like, I am recognizing the effort you're putting in. It is making a real tangible difference. None of us knows how this is going to turn out, but you're on the right track. I found that to be essential. Getting through those sort of arid times, I'll talk next week about this recording system I devised for myself. And it was sort of this archival method that, again, it's kind of orchestra specific, but I think it's adaptable to just about anything. I'm actually working with a jazz guitarist right now on setting it up for themselves. But it was this way of creating like a recording database of my own stuff that was tracking my progress and archiving over time. So that in my example, I could look back at like 4 years of me recording the same excerpt from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And anytime I was like, oh, God, I'm such a hack. Like, what am I doing? I'm just wasting my day. Like we all have these bad days, and we still do, of course. And that's natural, because, this progression is not a smooth line by any means. I mean, there's peaks, troughs, and valleys and setbacks, like you say. But this gave me a tangible way to listen to, like, okay, here's from April of 2008. Now here's September. Now here's March of 2009. And like listening to the same thing in this progression, getting better and better and better and better, just inarguably so, right? And it was a way for me to provide myself my own like objective evidence that I wasn't wasting my time. And that over time became this kind of powerful, like emotional backstop that was able to counter those all too human sort of like negative critic voices. And in terms, and especially in terms of the, few opportunities to play or few auditions, I honestly found that I made some of the most progress in those times. I'll describe how I sort of like broke down my project work and repertoire I was working on, and used the sort of like doldrums of like 4 to 6 months. It's like, wow, there's no auditions out there for timpani, right? Because there's only one timpanist per orchestra. But I would say, okay, fine. I'm going to make an audition happen for myself. I'm going to call together a bunch of friends, people whose ears I trust, maybe a teacher or two, and set up a mock and go play. And I'm going to take 12 weeks to like do a really deep dive into this same core repertoire and just go in and fix a lot of those problems that I haven't had time to fix before because I was under the gun for a different gig or a different audition or learning a bunch of new rep that I didn't know. And so that was one of the other ways that I was able to make that, be able to keep going through, as you say, the arid times.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that takes a certain kind of grit and dedication to kind of manufacture the fear that gets most of us in the practice room,
Well, and that's why I think it's also important. Like I do these sessions for different groups, but I'm always trying to come back to that idea that like even if I'm talking about a literal audition, like any time when you're putting yourself out there and feeling that in the best case scenario, it's sort of like the excited nerves of like being able to show what you're doing. But for some people it is fear, it's performance anxiety, and it can be really debilitating. But having a process to deal with that, I'll talk about this a little more next week too. But I found that even in the way I was practicing and having like a workflow in the practice room that was heavily reliant on recording myself and analyzing and troubleshooting, problem solving, brainstorming new techniques for how to, practice a tricky passage better or with more efficacy. That is this like one thinking, problem solving, analytical part of our brains. And if you're familiar with Timothy Galway's Inner Game of Tennis, he calls that self one. Self two is like performance state. It's very much like in the now, healthy mindset, quiet brain. If that's working well, we're getting beyond our nerves and the negative self-talk and all of that. And it was even it became a part of my practice process to be toggling between these two things quite literally, as I was on the one hand recording myself and doing that analysis, and on the other being like, okay, and now it's performance time and I'm just gonna play. So yeah. A lot more to unpack next week for those of you that can be there.
Definitely. And again, next week is also free, and I put up in the chat. I don't know if you want to save the chat. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you can go to the bottom of the chat, the 3 little dots, click on that, and you can save the chat, and that will have all those links that we talked about. But if you found us today, you'll find us for next week. And really looking forward to kind of a deep dive, and I think everybody's really interested in the nitty-gritty details of deliberate practice. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I really appreciate everybody showing up today, and really appreciate you, Jason. And we will see you next week.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.